Chicago didn't rise into America's second largest city because it was bold. It rose because it was willing to move faster than everyone else. In the 1920s, buildings went up overnight, livestock were processed faster than anywhere on Earth, and trains pushed people and goods through the streets without pause. Illegal liquor moved just as efficiently, turning Chicago into the nerve center of America's underworld. This was a city that rewarded ambition and removed anyone who couldn't keep up. Using cutting-edge image enhancement, we can now breathe new life into old photographs and forgotten streets, revealing Chicago as it actually looked a century ago. Come with me as we walk the streets of 1920s Chicago. By 1920, Chicago was home to nearly 3 million people, expanding outward from Lake Michigan in every direction. Immigrants from Eastern Europe, the American South, and the rural Midwest poured into the city, drawn by factory wages, stockyard work, and the promise of survival. The result was a city that never slowed down. Rail lines cut through neighborhoods, smoke hung permanently in the air. The ground vibrated day and night as trains, trucks, and streetcars passed without pause. Chicago didn't sleep, it kept moving. The lakefront told its own story. Lake Michigan stretched endlessly to the east, offering the only breathing room the city allowed. But even there, Chicago couldn't leave nature alone. Grant Park was being carved out of landfill, literal garbage compressed into parkland. Buckingham Fountain wouldn't arrive until later in the decade, but the intention was already clear. The city would bend even its shoreline to serve ambition. Along the docks, cargo ships arrived daily, carrying lumber, coal, and iron ore from the Great Lakes. Longshoremen worked in brutal shifts, loading and unloading freight in weather that froze fingers or melted resolve. The lake provided opportunity. It also carried danger. Drownings weren't rare. Bodies turned up regularly. Most went unidentified. In Chicago, risk wasn't exceptional. It was expected. Nowhere was this clearer than on the south side. There, spread across more than 500 acres, stood the Union stockyards. Every year, tens of millions of animals arrived by rail. Cattle entered alive and left as boxed meat, fertilizer, soap, and glue. Workers called it the disassembly line years before the term assembly line became famous. Inside, conveyor belts never stopped moving. Men repeated the same motions thousands of times a day. The air was hot and wet with steam. The smell of blood and chemicals clung to clothing long after shifts ended. Knives slipped. Hands were crushed. Injuries were routine. This was efficiency perfected, and it demanded human bodies to keep running. Chicago fed America, one exhausted worker at a time. What the stockyards left behind didn't disappear. It drained into the Chicago River. Near the yards, waste built up so thick that gases from decaying material caused the water to bubble on its own. Locals called it Bubbly Creek. The smell carried blocks away. Windows stayed shut even in summer. Fish didn't survive. People didn't linger. This wasn't an accident. It was the physical cost of a city pushing itself too hard. Further north, industry took different forms. Along Goose Island, factories lined both banks of the river. Tanneries processed leather until the water ran brown. Coal yards dumped black dust into the air. Warehouses stored grain, machinery, and bootleg whiskey side by side. Nobody asked questions, because asking questions slowed business. Bridges lifted and lowered constantly to let barges pass. Traffic backed up for blocks. Drivers shouted. Pedestrians squeezed between stopped cars. The rhythm of the city adjusted around the river's demands. But it never stopped entirely. At the Montgomery Ward headquarters, executives looked out over a city their catalogs helped build. Rural families across America ordered everything from the company's distribution centers along the Chicago River. Typewriters clacked, orders were processed, trains carried goods outward while money flowed back in. Chicago wasn't just making things, it was deciding what the rest of the country bought. Downtown, the city stacked itself vertically, elevated trains wrapped around the loop, roaring overhead every few minutes. Sparks snapped from the rails. Below, sidewalks never cleared. Office clerks, factory workers, delivery boys, and street vendors collided in the narrow space left to them. Standing still meant being late. Being late meant losing pay. And losing pay meant falling behind. Fast. Above the streets, movement was clean and efficient. Below them, survival was noisy and competitive. Along the Chicago River, the Wrigley Building rose white and immaculate. Its terracotta walls gleamed against the smoke-darkened skyline. Inside, offices were quiet and orderly. Executives discussed branding, advertising, and national markets, insulated from the chaos below. The same city worked very differently depending on where you stood. On State Street, department stores competed for dominance. Marshall Fields anchored the retail district with 7 floors of everything a family could want or be convinced they needed. Saleswomen stood behind glass counters demonstrating perfumes and cosmetics. The Tiffany ceiling glowed above the main floor. Elevators carried shoppers upward while their money stayed behind. Across the street, Carson Pirie Scott offered similar promises wrapped in different architecture. But behind the counters, a different story unfolded. Young women worked 12-hour shifts on their feet. Pay was low. Unions were discouraged. Getting caught sitting down meant dismissal. The glamour on display required invisible exhaustion to maintain. Further south, the Chicago Board of Trade occupied a commanding position at the end of LaSalle Street. Inside, men shouted buy and sell orders for grain they'd never see, from farms they'd never visit. Fortunes shifted on weather reports from Kansas and crop yields from Iowa. The city's wealth wasn't built on what Chicago made, it was built on what Chicago moved. West of downtown, the sound changed. Maxwell Street exploded into motion every weekend. Vendors shouted in half a dozen languages at once. Food sizzled on open grills. Bargaining never stopped. Musicians played on street corners as guitars, fiddles, and voices blended into something new. Immigrant families lived packed into nearby buildings. Children worked early. Coal dust settled into the walls and into people's lungs. At that point, everything was about getting through the week. North of the river, another immigrant neighborhood took shape. Little Italy stretched along Taylor Street, dense with bakeries, social clubs, and Catholic churches. Grandmothers watched from windows. Children played in alleys because there were no parks. Men gathered in coffee houses, speaking dialects that varied from block to block. Prohibition changed the economics overnight. Some families brewed wine in basements for personal use. Others did it for profit. The line between survival and crime became harder to distinguish. Police looked the other way. For a price. To the northwest, Polish immigrants dominated entire neighborhoods. Milwaukee Avenue became a commercial spine lined with butcher shops, hardware stores, and savings banks with signs in Polish. Churches anchored street corners. Weddings filled entire blocks with celebration. Chicago didn't melt cultures together. It kept them separate and charged rent to everyone. On the south side, another city existed inside Chicago. African Americans fleeing violence and poverty in the South arrived in massive numbers during the Great Migration. They were confined by law and intimidation to a narrow stretch of land known as the Black Belt. Rent was higher, space was tighter, entire families crowded into single rooms. And yet, something unexpected happened. Churches, newspapers, clubs, and businesses multiplied. Jazz spilled into the streets. Creativity flourished under pressure. Chicago tried to restrict a population and instead concentrated culture. On State Street south of downtown, the Stroll became the heart of Black Chicago's nightlife. The Dreamland Cafe and the Sunset Cafe packed audiences in every night. Louis Armstrong played trumpet until dawn. Bessie Smith performed when passing through. The music was new, improvised, urgent, alive. White audiences came to listen. The Defender, Chicago's black newspaper, circulated throughout the South, encouraging migration and documenting every injustice the city's power structure tried to hide. Robert Abbott ran the paper from a building on State Street, turning journalism into both a business and a movement. Words moved almost as dangerously as bullets. Further east, near the lake, the wealthy built a different Chicago. The Gold Coast stretched along the shoreline with mansions, private clubs, and tree-lined streets insulated from the chaos elsewhere. Servants entered through back doors. Deliveries arrived discreetly. The noise of industry was distant enough to ignore. Women dressed for afternoon tea while their husbands managed wealth generated by the factories, stockyards, and railroads they never personally visited. In 1920, alcohol was banned nationwide. In Chicago, the ban barely slowed the flow. Liquor moved through alleys and warehouses at night. Speakeasies operated behind ordinary doors. Bribes became routine. Violence wasn't shocking. It was normal. Shootings appeared in newspapers so often they blurred together. The law didn't disappear. It just couldn't keep up. In Cicero, just beyond the city limits, Al Capone built an empire. The suburb became a criminal headquarters with its own police force on the payroll. Breweries operated openly, money flowed upward, enforcement flowed away. On Valentine's Day, 1929, 7 men were lined against a garage wall on North Clark Street and shot execution style. The massacre made headlines nationally, but in Chicago, it was simply the most visible example of what had become ordinary. Violence was a business expense. Bodies were collateral damage. Even the legitimate businesses learned to operate in the grey. Hotel managers rented rooms without asking questions. Taxi drivers knew which addresses meant danger. Doctors treated gunshot wounds and kept silent. Survival required selective blindness. At night, movie palaces like the Chicago Theatre offered something else. Bright lights, grand interiors. For a few hours, exhausted audiences could forget the noise, the smoke, and the danger outside. Entertainment didn't offer dreams. It offered rest. But even entertainment served the machine. Vaudeville houses like the Palace Theatre churned through performers nightly. Acts travelled the circuit, Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit, repeating the same routines to different crowds. Success meant moving to New York. Failure meant disappearing entirely. On the north side, Wrigley Field drew crowds for Cubs games during the day. Baseball offered a rhythm different from the factory whistle. Innings passed slowly. Vendors sold peanuts and beer, though after 1920, the beer had to be carefully concealed. The game didn't matter as much as the break from routine. In a few hours, it would all start over again. By the end of the decade, cracks began to appear. Factories slowed, markets wobbled. The pace that defined Chicago began to strain. The city had been built to outrun limits. It was about to find them. Chicago in the 1920s was not an exception. It was a blueprint. Across the 20th century, entire streets would be reshaped, erased or forgotten, not just by time, but by progress itself. This was only one city, and there is so much more to uncover. If you want to keep walking the forgotten streets of the 20th century, make sure you're subscribed. We'll see you in the next city.